Welcome to this event about managing updates and features. and Me, who's talking, my name is Johan Persson. I work at a small consultant firm in Stockholm called Engage Group, and we are about 40 specialists who our normal practice is to go in and help customers on the customer side and strengthen their organizations, especially customers who want to drive their ERP projects themselves. But today we'll be talking about how to manage features and updates. And a couple of years ago, Microsoft released their OneVersion vision, which means that they will be releasing updates on a much higher cadence than before, especially if you're from an AX 2012 situation, where my experience was mostly that customers tended to avoid updating because it generally was a big project and it took a lot of time and resources and testing and regression testing and so on. But now we don't really have that option because Microsoft will push the updates even if we want it or not. We have the option to skip some of them. But this session is basically about how do we do this in a way that means that we don't have to work ourselves to death. So let's get started. So OneVersion, just a quick recap for those of you who are not familiar with it. So as I said, a couple of years ago, Microsoft released something that they called OneVersion. It's a vision on how to upgrade an environment, and it mostly handles how development is done and how they are going to release updates. So we have today about 8 to 10 releases a year, which Microsoft is releasing on a schedule. We have two of those are larger releases, but the whole point in why this actually works and why it didn't work in AX 2012 is that the main thing that we have done here is that we have switched from overlayering to something called extensions. And overlaying that we had in AX 2012 basically meant that we went in and we rewrote Microsoft's code. We replaced code that Microsoft had written, which means that when we are going to do updates, we push back the Microsoft code to the system again, which overwrite our changes, which means that we need to re-implement all of our changes again. We need to test them, we need to verify them. And then the next time we're doing the update, we do exactly the same process again. What extension points is that Microsoft has created places in the AX code where we are allowed to insert code. So here you can insert code. This does things. There are a couple of rules around how to do this, but the whole point is that we are never replacing Microsoft's code. We are maybe counteracting what they are doing, but we are never replacing their code lines, which means that they can basically push their code on top of ours and it will never overlap in any places, which is a good thing because that means that we don't have to work against Microsoft all the time. And we can also have a better look on what they are releasing. That's not saying that there won't be breaking changes, but there will be breaking changes, and of course there might be bugs, of course. But when we looked at the life cycle that Microsoft is pushing, there might be breaking changes, but at least they have promised us that they will tell us about the breaking changes way in advance. So what does this extensions mean? So first of all, we have support for continuous updates. It's much easier to do the updates. Upgradability is not an issue anymore because we will basically not be upgrading. We will be updating. It's a iterative process instead. Also, Microsoft put a lot of pressure on ISVs to follow these guidelines. So they are not allowed to do any of this overlayering code either, which means that it's much easier to implement an ISV than it used to be before. It also improves the supportability and serviceability of the system. So if we are going to push updates 10 times a year, and with that a lot of feature updates, that will require a lot of things of us if we don't have this in place. And also the initial implementation is much easier, because another thing that they have done is that we have good API interfaces and connections to, for instance, Power Platform, which means that we can also choose to move code out of the core product, out of our customizations, and into one of these low code, no code experiences in order to make the system less complex. So, as I said before, we have 8 updates a year. 2 of these are dedicated major updates, major releases. That's not really true, because what it actually means is that is the time when Microsoft announces new functionality, and that's also the time when they tell us what is coming. But that doesn't mean that it's coming right now. It might be rolling out over time. And I think that that's basically a good thing, because that means that we won't get all of these major new features in one push. We will get them spread out over all of the 8 releases, which means that we can test, we can verify, we can educate our users. And it also means that they will wait with releasing the features until they are actually done, in this case. We have the ability to skip up to 3 releases, which means that we could basically do 2 releases a year. My personal opinion of this is that this is not a good thing, because then you're always at the end of the plank. You're always in a situation where we need to do this release. We absolutely need to do this release. And if we don't, we're sort of screwed, because we can't skip it anymore. I mean, it's good to be able to skip them, but that should be in emergencies, according to me at least. And we could also be 1 behind or 2 behind if we want, which means that we're not really at the edge of the plank, but we have the option to wait and see. But I mean, that is also sort of a middle ground solution. But the problem here is that Microsoft is always doing the testing on the latest version. The major part of the testing is done on the latest version, which means that we are actually implementing an older version, which means that it might not be as tested as the one they are currently on. There is a release schedule on Docs, where we can see all of the new versions coming in, when they will be released to preview, when they will be general available, when they will be auto updated. Because that's also one important thing to know, is that if you don't update, Microsoft will update for you. So then you think, okay, so then they will be testing things. Nope, they won't be testing one single thing. They will just push the update, and it's up to you to see to it that it works. And then we have another important date as well, and that's the end of service. The end of service tells you that after this point, this version will not be supported anymore. So this version, you are not allowed. You are allowed, but you will not get full support if you're running this after the end of service date, which is also an important part, which means that that's the end of the plank. That's where you absolutely need to get off this version. Another important part in this is that when it comes to updates, Microsoft is normally releasing hotfixes, quality updates. We will come to those a bit later, but they're normally releasing quality updates for the latest version and not for the previous version. They might, in some cases, backport it to the previous version, but that doesn't happen to all of the hotfixes. I mentioned the preview ring, and this is also an important part because when you choose to implement the version after GA in your production environment, you're actually not the first, not even close, because we have a couple of rings that we need to take into account. So first of all, we have the ring 0, which is the feature team. They are the ones who work on the product. They are testing it as well. Then then we have the RVP ring, which is for the finance and operations team, the ones that also release the product. Then we have the targeted release, and that is the preview program. This is not supported to run in production, but you can always set up an environment just to verify that it's actually working, that it doesn't break your current processes and so on. Third ring is first release. First release is basically preview, but it runs in production. So when you go into deploying the standard release, the GA release, a lot of customers have already run the product for a while in production. So you're absolutely not the first to implement it, which means that if things haven't been discovered up until this point, the bugs are probably not there. I'm saying probably because I mean you might be in a situation where you have a very niche business process that doesn't take this into account. It might be that you have done things a little bit differently than was originally expected, which means that you might do things in a way that is not supported anymore, which means that it will break. And since it was never meant to be used this way, this is not something that's been part of the testing, and it might be a very few customers who have done it. But since there are people running the solution, you might be fairly confident that they're actually doing what it says. So when it comes to major and minor updates, what you can do is that you need to skip each and every if you want to skip a deploy, you need to do it manually in LCS, and you need to do it for every maintenance window. I tend to recommend that you do this anyway, because I really don't feel comfortable with the auto update, not yet. So I tend to pause the update and then do it manually anyway, or I do it manually before the maintenance window, so that I don't have to having trouble sleeping at night just because I know that someone is fiddling with my environment. Another big part here is that Microsoft is also testing some of this code. So you can go into a program, which means that Microsoft will use your customizations and your database and run your RSAT testing in their environment, just to make sure that your business processes are not failing. But this requires you to, first of all, share your database, which I know that some organizations is not comfortable with. You need to share your customizations, which normally isn't that big of an issue. But you also need to build all of the RSAT test cases that you want Microsoft to test, and you need to maintain them and verify that they're actually working the way that you want. So, and you also need to make sure that you keep up with what's happening in the next sprint. So when you go into a new sprint, you need to make sure that at the end of this sprint, we are going with this version of the Microsoft release. And we will come to that at the end of the seminar. regarding these sprints and the application lifecycle, because I think that is a very important part in how we do this going forward. Okay, so we've talked about the 8 major fixes, the 8 major releases. In between those, we have something called quality updates. So Microsoft will release for every support issue that they're seeing, they will release a hotfix to fix the problem, and that hotfix is then released after the major release. They are always cumulative, so if you need, for instance, a specific fix, you will always have to have all of the previous fixes as well. You can't skip and selectively pick out which fixes you are going with. And as I said before, these are sometimes backported, which means that the latest version will always get them. But in some cases, they are actually released even to older versions. I see that we have questions coming in. I will pause the questions for now because I'm by myself here, so I really can't read them at the same time. So the next part in this is the features. So for every major release, Microsoft is releasing new features, a lot of new features, in fact. So if you look into an environment today that hasn't been, where you haven't added any features, you will probably be around 300 or 400 updates which are not enabled. So we need to figure out how to handle these, and we need to have a process on keeping this list hopefully down to a minimum. We also have features which are not in Dynamics, but which are actually outside of Dynamics. Microsoft has been starting to work with microservices, which means that some of the functionality from the core system, they're actually moving out of the core system. New features that are coming out of the core system, not within Dynamics. So example of this is the new MRP solution, which is done in an Azure instance. And also there is also the Finance Insights, which has to do with trying to predict customer payments and so on. Those are built outside, and I think this is a good thing because that actually means that the code base within Dynamics gets less complex, and we have fewer dependencies that we need to take into account when it comes to the updates and so on. All of the features used to be off by default. I'm saying used to be because right now there is actually hotfixes rolling out that are features rolling out which are on by default. And this is something that you need to look into because some of these new features that are on by default might actually break your processes. So you need to test for them. As long as they're on by default, they can be turned off. Eventually, they will become mandatory, and then you can turn them off. So you actually need to do this while they are in the on by default state or something like that. So what does these features really compose of? So we have regional features. There are a lot of legal requirements for specific countries or regions which are in these features. And we need to figure out how to handle each of these categories. So when it comes to regional features, you can think in one of 2 different ways. The first way is we're not using Brazil. So why should we enable Brazil? You can also switch it and think we are not using Brazil. We might as well enable Brazil because we're not using it anyway, so it shouldn't affect us. And we will come to this a bit further along. Then we have the UI features. Those are things that changes in the UI. One of the most important one that has been in history is the new UI, the new grid feature. And this is actually important because it tend to break things when it comes to, for instance, remote testing, or automated testing and so on. So you need to figure this out. And the features, the UI features, actually also might mean that you need to retrain some of the users because buttons appear or disappear. New grids look in a different way. We have the locked columns, for instance, that you can actually use more like you do in Excel, where you can lock a single column to be in one place all of the time, even though you scroll side to side, and the column will still be visible. So that has to do with, you need to train your users to use the system as optimal as possible. But I think the features all in all is good, because it actually means that the system that you're already paying for is getting better by the day. Then we have the performance features, and this, for me at least, is a no-brainer. You need to test them, of course, but these are actually features which makes the system snappier and faster, and that's important as well. So a feature coming in can be in one of 4 different states. It can be a preview. In that case, it's not supported to run in production. That's not saying that some companies aren't running them in production. Depends a bit on the feature, but it might be a fairly innocuous feature which could be run in production. Then you have the released ones, and those have been released to the system. Then you have ones going into on by default. And this is a new state that came in, I think, 10.0.22 or 23, which means that if a feature goes into on by default, then you can almost count on the fact that it will eventually become mandatory. And that's when you really need to look into implementing it and having it set up. And then you have the mandatory features. Those are the features that you can't turn off anymore. So what do I think of these features? I actually think that you should try to aim for having all features enabled. That should be your goal. The reason for that is that I think that when Microsoft is testing their code, their new version, they are testing it with all of the features enabled, which means that if you're testing it when they're not enabled, you might not really see the full effect of the system. And also, what happens if you turn it off at a later stage? If someone by mistake turns it off at a later stage, then it might come as a surprise, and then you will have problems because you turned it off later. So my recommendation is probably try to keep this list as empty as possible. So discussing the on by default, this is something new, as I said before, and when I looked at this at the first time, I didn't really realize the full scope of on by default, because you could say, okay, it's on by default, I can turn it off, and then the next time it won't be on by default, so that's fine. But the problem here is that on by default is part of a plan, because what I think Microsoft realized is that the customers weren't turning the features on. They were staying with the old feature set, sort of as like they did in AX 2012, which means that the new features weren't being used, which also meant that the new features weren't being tested by customers, because in order to test them, I mean, Microsoft can do internal testing, they do internal testing, but the real test comes when you actually deploy it in production. So I think it's very important that we try to keep up with the updates. But as I said before, on by default is part of a plan. So if a feature gets set to on by default, for instance, in the October release, then you can expect it to become mandatory in the April release. So that really means that you can't really sit down and expect nothing to change in your system. Everything will change, and you will have to keep up. It sounds harsh, but that's the fact. And I think that there are more pluses than minuses in this. That you will have a system that gets better over time. I think that's also very, very important. So I mentioned a couple of times that you need to be doing testing. You need to test the updates. You need to test the features. But how do we do this? So first of all, ongoing testing. You need to test every single time. That's not say you need to test everything every single time, but you need to test things every single time. And doing automatic testing means that you will actually do this a bit easier. It will get easier to test things if you do it automatically, because if you build your test library up to, 100, 200, 300,000 test cases, you can run them every single time you do a deploy, not only for your customizations, but also when you do the Microsoft deploy, which I think is important here. When it comes to testing Microsoft's code, I tend to advocate for implicit testing rather than explicit testing. The last customer I was with, they said, so how should we actually test Microsoft's code? And I think the solution here is that we shouldn't. And that's not saying that we shouldn't test it at all, but I think that the problem is that if we should explicitly test every single code line that Microsoft is releasing, every single feature, single change to everything, we won't have time to do anything else. We will have to have a team of like 50 ERP consultants doing nothing but testing all of the time, and that won't really work. So, and I will come to my solution later, but what I'm thinking is that we should start dogfooding Microsoft's releases as early as possible in our release cycle, which means that the earlier we can start using it, the more of the bugs we will probably see, and the less of the bugs will eventually make it out to production. So also, we need to scope our testing, because I really don't believe that we will be able to do every single test every single time, because that won't really work. That will be a lot of testing. And talking about the scope, there is actually, and I'm not really sure if this is a released feature yet, but there is a feature coming to LCS which is called Impact Analyzer. And the Impact Analyzer, what it does is actually that it compares your usage of the system to Microsoft's release. So it actually tells you if you are using the new features coming out, or if you're more using the old features that has been there for a while. So that basically means that if you look at this diagram, the higher up to the right a dot is, the more you need to test it. The lower down to the left it is, the less you need to test it, because the ones that are down in the lower left corner are things that you are probably not using that much and hasn't changed that much. But things that are in the upper right corner has a lot of use and a lot of change. Those are the places where you should probably look for bugs, and where you should probably expect things to go wrong, so to speak. So for my final thoughts, I would like to start off with sort of a philosophical question. I got the question the other day: what is the difference between a project and a product? A project, since we have a 30-second lag here, I will answer my own question. The project is something that ends. you have an end date, you have a closing date on a project. You don't have you have a start date and you have an end date. If we are talking about the product, a product is something that you need to maintain. And I think what we have done is that before we used to have implementation projects. We used to have update projects. We used to have ISV projects. Used to have activating specific modules or countries or rolling out in a new country projects. I think we should see D365 FO more as a product, something that we need to attend to during the entire life cycle in order to be able to handle it, to survive. So how do we do this life cycle? So a hint here is agility. As I said before, we can't really see it as a project anymore. We need to see it as a product. We need to have the life cycle going on for more or less eternity. And the reason for that is that we will probably need to do changes. We will probably need to do customizations. But Microsoft is also deprecating things. They're changing things. They're adding new functionality. They're adding new entities, which we need to take into account. So that means that we can't really sort of close down the project once we are implemented and done. So the updates, please use them iteratively. I mean, we need to have updates every single sprint, so to speak. We need to do updates. And my recommendation here is try to take the updates as early as possible. I tend to update my environments at day one of the sprint. That means that we will have 3, 4, 5, depending on your sprint length, weeks to actually use the new system. We use it and we test it and we verify that it actually works. Not in that we do specific testing, but rather that we use it every single day. So if we do a test of a process and it doesn't break, it's probably fairly safe. You should only skip updates when absolutely necessary. If you end up in a situation where you 2 days before sprint release realize that there is a bug in the new release, of course you should skip it. You shouldn't risk it. But you should only do it if you have a specific reason. The default answer to updating should be yes, we should update. Not no, not this time. And also, please implement a process for automatic regression testing, or at least regression testing. Set up the scripts, and if you're setting up the scripts anyway, you should probably think about implementing them in RSAT or Executive Automates or any other of the automatic test suites that are available, and then link it to your DevOps project. So when you build the packages, you should actually do the testing integrated in the build anyway. When it comes to the features, keep them as part of your backlog. When you plan your new sprint, you should have a bullet point saying at least 20 new features. Push them in. I mean, eventually you will get to a place where you in sync with Microsoft, and then you maybe not need 20 new features, but you should try to cut down the feature backlog as much as possible and have it part of every single sprint, just so that you don't skip it, because these things tend to, since no one really looks at them, since no one really needs them, they tend to be forgotten about, and they should be part of the sprint release. So prioritize them, maybe grade them on risk. So the less risky ones you should probably try to push in directly, and the more risky ones you should probably test and verify and maybe have a process round and train your users and so on. the best way to test things, I think, is an end-to-end testing. So try to set up your tests in testing your actual business processes, not testing a specific small feature, but verify that you can actually do your work. That's the most important part. If you can do your processes, then you're probably fine. And also default to yes. And what do I mean with default to yes? If there is a new feature coming in, the default answer to should we implement this is yes. You need to come up with a reason why you shouldn't, not why you should. Okay, so some final thoughts. Thing has already been done. You didn't have to test it. Microsoft has tested it. Preview customers has tested it. First release customers has tested it, and so on. The next part, the impact should be minimal thanks to the extension architecture. You should probably not see any issues. That's not saying that you don't need to test, but you should be fairly assured in that this probably won't break. I have an example here because when Microsoft has done this on other products for a long time. Windows, Office, Exchange, Office 365, they are doing application lifecycle management every single day. So I think that they have a pretty good grasp on how this works, and they don't want your things to break. They are doing everything in their power to see to it that it doesn't break. And one good example here is that in, I think it was 2000, Microsoft released what today is called Windows Update. That's the part that updates your Windows computer every single month. Sometimes 2 or 3 times a month, but normally once every month. And in the beginning, people were very, very skeptical. We had a lot of fixes that broke things and that didn't work at all, which meant that a lot of large organizations actually have like a big test farm of all of their different computers with all of their different applications. And we're talking a lot of applications. The take any random big company, and I would dare you not to find like 5,000 different applications in that company, which means that they need to test every single permutation of every single application, which doesn't really work. You won't be able to do it. So big customers today, for instance, the US defense, they actually do it the opposite way. They have 5% of users taking the new updates, and if things doesn't break, we just deploy it to everything else. Because they figure that it's easier and cheaper to fix the issue rather than to spend all of this time testing. And of course, the people listening today, they are all ERP consultants. They think that ERP is absolutely the most important system in the entire company. So this is the holy grail, so to speak. But on the other hand, if you think about it, what would happen if Office 365 went down? What would happen if SharePoint went down? What would happen if your locking system went down? And what I'm saying is that there are other systems that are really, really important, which means that in some cases we might need to trust Microsoft a bit. Okay, so you're already paying for the improvements. You should probably have as a goal to implement them, because otherwise you're paying for nothing, so to speak. And as I said, some of them are actually performance improvements and so on. So I think that's important. As I said before, some amount of trust will be required here. We will not be able to test everything, because then we wouldn't do much other things than testing. If you want, please keep a pre-release environment around. That way you can actually verify some of the things even before it gets into your dev environment. And also instruct your developers to keep a lookout in the compilation logs, because all of the things that are being deprecated, entities and fields and tables and so on, they will pop up a warning in the compiler. So the developer knows probably a year before something happens that this is going to happen. So please have them keep an eye on this. And as I said before, implicit testing. Instead of explicitly testing every single feature, try to use the system as much as possible, even in the pre-release form, even before it goes to production, to verify that your actual business processes are working end to end. That's an important part. So questions. I can see here in our chat that we have a couple of questions. So from Inna, had a question about enabling features and would you recommend enabling all features, none or only selected new features? I have seen all three scenarios at customers and curious about your recommendation. I mentioned that sort of. My recommendation is probably to go with a complete feature update. And the reason for that is that is what Microsoft is working with. That is what Microsoft is testing for. So that is probably what the customer and the partners should be aiming for. Also from Ina, Impact Analyzer is available for production environments only, correct? I think it's available for all Microsoft hosted environment, not for tier 1 environments. So I actually think that you should, and that's the reason why I try to roll out the new version to all pre-production environments as soon as possible. Not only dev and test, I roll it out to dev, test, UAT, all pre-production environment, with the exception of the support environment. I try to install this as soon as possible. Okay, Klaus has a question. Can we explain why each upgrade includes 500 to 600 bugs fixes? What I mean is quite many per year. I totally agree with you. That is the question I get from most of my customers. How could it be that Microsoft is still releasing 300 to 400 fixes every single year for a system that should be production ready? It can't be a good sign. And I would say that I tend to look at it the other way around. If Microsoft is releasing 4,000 fixes for the system every single year, I would say that speaks a lot to their commitment to the system, their ambition in keeping it working and improving it every single time. And I think it's important that we realize that before, when we had our on-prem AX 2012, sometimes I've heard the thought that it takes so much time to send a support request to Microsoft. So I think that we will try to fix it ourselves instead. That might be a good way to do it when you have an on-premise system, because then you get a faster release. In the cloud-hosted version, you're not really able to do that. So it's really, really important to send support requests to Microsoft for every single issue that you have, because if they don't get the support requests, they don't fix the issue, which means that you will have to have this issue for a long time. And I think they have basically released the same amount of fixes in AX 2012. It's just that we didn't have to install them, or we choose not to install them, so we never saw them. So if you look, for instance, I mean, one of the things that we used to do when I worked for another partner was that in some cases we actually broke up a hotfix package just to install one single fix. And that is sort of part of the problem of why the system doesn't work, because if everyone is on a different version of the system, there is no way for Microsoft to maintain it anyhow. Okay, so Ina, a new question. I like the approach of seeing D365 as a product rather than a project. Thank you for this insight. You're welcome. I mean, I think that's the only viable way. I mean, you don't select which updates you're getting to Office or to online CRM or to Office 365 or to Windows, because I mean, you treat it more like a service instead of a project. So I think that's a good point as well. So that was everything I had right now. If no one has any more questions, I really would like to thank you for being available and looking at the webinar today. And we are going to hold a couple of more webinars. So in approximately 2 weeks, I think there is one coming up that we will be where we will be discussing microservices and how that impacts the Dynamics 365 FO product. And I hope to see you then, and hope you've had a good day. If you look at this afterwards, please just, I mean, leave a comment in the comment section, and I'll take it into account. So Tobias, based on your recommendations for implicit testing, my understanding is that you're recommending releasing the update to production in combination with the customizations features at the end of the sprint. This is opposed to separating Microsoft updates from customization releases. Have I understood that correctly? You are perfectly on the point, because otherwise we will have to have 2 releases, and we would be testing the releases separately, which I don't think really is a point. I mean, we are releasing customizations to an ongoing updated platform, which means that if we're trying to release to an old version and then we're upgrading, I mean, we might as well test the new customizations with the new code. And if we sort of have the default that, okay, Microsoft probably know what they're doing, they are probably not wanting to break our things, then at least, I mean, I know, Tobias, that you're a developer. That means that you will actually be able to see the compiler compile the new customizations on the new version, which means that you will get a heads up. I mean, this will of course mean that in some cases, if there is a bug in the Microsoft release, we might need to hold our release and maybe break. If we have an urgent hotfix in our release, then we might need to break that hotfix out, test it on the current production version, and push it to production outside of the normal sprint release. I mean, if there are urgent hotfixes, that might be a way to do it. But normally, I would say that we release the Microsoft update and the sprint release at the same time. I hope that answers your question. All right, so I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. And if you have more questions, I know that, as I said before, there is a lag between what you're seeing and what I'm talking about. So if you have more questions, just leave them in the comments, and I will answer them as much as possible. Thank you for today, everyone, and have a nice Friday and weekend. Bye-bye.